Welcome, everyone. Today, we're going deep on something that I think should be at the top of the mind for anyone making policy in sport: violence against women and girls.
Absolutely.
We'll be pulling from the handbook, tackling violence against women and girls in sport by UNESCO and UN Women.
Great source.
Yeah, and, we need to be thinking about how to craft legislation and policies that actually protect everyone's right to participate safely.
Right. And this is something that impacts way more than just, individual cases.
Right.
This impacts the entire sporting world and even has economic impacts, as we'll see.
Yeah, and right from the start, I was hit with this statistic.
Okay.
Almost 21% of professional female athletes have experienced sexual abuse as children in sport,
Wow.
nearly double the rate for men.
That's a powerful number. And it's something that should make all of us stop and think about what we can do to address this problem.
Yeah, so clearly this problem is deeply ingrained,
Yeah.
and we need to look beyond just the surface-level solutions. We need to understand, what constitutes violence against women and girls in sport? Because we're not just talking about physical assault.
Right.
So help me unpack this a bit. The UN Declaration gives us this really broad definition, but what does that look like in the real world of sport?
Okay. Well, you have athletes who are striving for excellence,
Right.
often in these really competitive environments.
Yeah.
And this can create opportunities for various types of abuse,
Okay.
whether it's economic exploitation through unfair contracts, psychological manipulation by coaches, online harassment, and of course, the very real threat of sexual violence.
So it's not just about individual bad actors, right?
Mm,
The handbook really emphasizes this concept of intersectionality.
yeah.
What do they mean by that?
So a woman's race, sexual orientation, disability status, these factors all intersect, and it creates these layers of vulnerability.
Right.
And the handbook gives a really good example with Manuela Bonelli, a volleyball coach in Italy.
Okay.
Her contract explicitly discriminated against her because she was a lesbian, stating that she'd be removed if she bothered any of the players.
So this isn't just about, someone being abusive. It's about the system itself creating the conditions for abuse,
Yeah,
like a system of oppression.
exactly. And, the impact goes beyond just individual suffering. The World Bank estimates that violence against women and girls actually costs countries up to 3.7% of their GDP.
Wow.
To put that in perspective, that's roughly what many countries spend on primary education.
So it's not just a social concern.
Yeah,
It's an economic drain,
exactly.
something that policymakers really can't ignore.
Hmm.
So let's zoom out a bit and think about the structure of the sports world itself.
Okay.
How does that contribute to this problem?
Think of the sports ecosystem as a pyramid.
Okay.
At the base, you have grassroots participation, local clubs, school teams. And then as you move up, you have national governing bodies, international federations, and then at the very top, this very powerful, often commercialized elite level.
Okay, so what you're saying is as we move up that pyramid,
Yeah.
the power dynamics become more and more intense,
Yeah.
which leads to more opportunities for abuse.
Exactly. And to give you an example, at the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, only 13% of the coaches were women. Globally, fewer than 10% of registered football coaches are women.
So it's still a very male-dominated field.
Extremely.
Yeah.
And that creates, an environment where abuse is more likely to occur, especially when you consider the culture of winning at all costs.
Right.
That permeates a lot of these spaces.
Yeah, the handbook goes beyond just the stats, though. They talk about specific examples
They do.
that really show this power dynamic in action.
Right. And one that really stands out is the case of Karamuddin Karim, the former president of the Afghan Football Federation. He was actually a former warlord.
Wow.
And he used his position to systematically abuse female players.
It's hard to even imagine the level of impunity he was operating with.
It's awful.
What does that say about accountability within these systems?
It shows that there's a real lack of accountability. Abuse is often silenced or covered up to protect the reputation of the people in charge and just maintain that status quo.
Right.
And the handbook dives deep into the shortcomings of reporting mechanisms. And what's even more concerning is the lack of support for survivors who do come forward.
It's like this vicious cycle.
It is.
Because if people are afraid to speak out,
Yeah,
then the problem just continues.
absolutely. And a good example of that is Ine Aluko, a star British footballer. She faced horrific racism from her coaches,
Right.
but her initial complaints were totally dismissed.
Ignored.
Yeah, it was only when she went public that a proper investigation happened and confirmed that she had, in fact, been abused.
Yeah, her story really shows that even for someone with a huge platform like that, achieving justice is a battle.
Yeah,
So it seems like we're talking about this complex web of power dynamics,
Yeah.
systemic failures, individual cases that have these huge ripple effects. And it feels like we're just scratching the surface here. I know the handbook talks about some really specific cases
Right.
that highlight the challenges that we're facing.
Yeah.
So where should we go next?
Well, one that we can't ignore is the USA gymnastics scandal.
Right.
And it's not just about the horrific actions of Larry Nassar.
Right.
It's about the institutional failures
Yeah.
that allowed this to happen to hundreds of young women and girls for over a decade.
It's a case that really, I think, shook the entire sporting world.
Yeah.
And, it's important to think about how this went on for so long.
Yeah, and the handbook highlights the pressure that these young athletes were under.
Right.
Olympic medalist Ali Raisman, one of Nassar's victims,
Right.
talked about how athletes had to see him. Like,
Wow.
refusal could be reported
Jeez.
and could jeopardize their careers.
Then you have this incredibly vulnerable population facing this predator in a position of power.
Right.
And then you add on top of that the failure of institutions like beyond just USA Gymnastics
Exactly.
to stop this.
So the FBI received reports about Nassar as early as 2015,
Wow.
but they failed to act quickly.
Oh, my God.
And that inaction allowed the abuse to continue for years. So you see these failures at multiple levels
Right.
within the sporting organization itself, within law enforcement, and ultimately a societal failure to protect these children.
But some good did come out of this.
Yeah, I mean...
Like some positive change.
Yeah, the survivors who so bravely came forward really forced a reckoning. Their testimony led to some legislative changes in the U.S. that made reporting of sexual assault allegations mandatory and improved the handling of cases that involve minors. It also led to the creation of the U.S. Center for Safe Sport, dedicated to addressing abuse in amateur athletics.
So it's a tragic reminder that sometimes it takes something this huge to create real change.
It's awful that that's the case.
Yeah.
But that's sometimes how it goes, unfortunately. And even with those changes, the fight's not over.
Right.
The handbook highlights the experiences of transgender athletes who face unique challenges.
Right.
You have Kristen Worley, a Canadian cyclist who wanted to compete in the Olympics.
Yeah, I remember her story.
And she was subjected to these humiliating sex tests, even after legally changing her gender and meeting all the requirements.
It's so dehumanizing.
It's awful.
Yeah.
And it shows how existing systems can be discriminatory, even when there's this framework for inclusion.
Right.
So Worley's case, along with the ongoing debates about transgender athletes, show that we need policies that are actually equitable, not just performative.
Yeah. And it's a reminder that for many athletes, just the fight for basic respect and dignity is still ongoing.
It is.
And beyond these really high-profile cases, I know the handbook talks about specific risk factors that can make certain groups more vulnerable.
Yeah.
So can we dive into that a little bit?
Absolutely. So one of the most vulnerable groups is young athletes.
Of course.
They're often dependent on their coaches, they're eager to please, and they might not have the tools yet to recognize or resist abuse. And that makes them prime targets for grooming, which the handbook describes as particularly insidious form of abuse.
So what exactly is grooming? Like, how does that work?
So it's a process where the abuser builds trust, often over a long period of time, to manipulate and exploit the athlete. And it can be hard to detect because they often present as a caring, supportive figure.
So it's like a wolf in sheep's clothing.
Exactly.
And it makes it even more important to have strong safeguarding measures in place for youth sports.
Absolutely.
Now, the handbook also talks about the unique challenges that women of color face.
Yeah, and this goes beyond the very obvious issue of racism within sport. Black women athletes in particular often face huge pressure to conform to Eurocentric beauty standards. They're judged not just on their athletic performance, but also on their hair, their body type, their overall appearance.
It's like they're being judged on two completely different sets of criteria.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that constant scrutiny can make them feel objectified and devalued, which can then lead to further abuse, whether it's verbal harassment or discriminatory treatment.
And then, of course, you also have LGBTQIA+ athletes who have faced so much hostility and exclusion in the sporting world.
And despite the progress that's been made in some areas, homophobia and transphobia are still really prevalent in many sporting environments. The handbook really stresses the need for inclusive spaces, but that requires more than just lip service.
You got to be genuine.
It does.
Yeah.
It's about creating a culture where athletes feel safe to be themselves without fear of being harassed or discriminated against.
Right. And we can't forget athletes with disabilities either,
Absolutely not.
because they face, a much higher risk of abuse
They do.
and often lack access to resources and support.
Yeah, they do.
So as policymakers, we have to be thinking about all these different groups
They do.
and addressing this issue on multiple fronts.
Yes.
But it's a bit daunting, right?
It is.
Like, where do we even start?
Yeah.
Thankfully, the handbook doesn't just lay out the problems.
It doesn't.
It talks about some solutions as well.
It does.
So what are some of the things that are working?
There are some encouraging initiatives out there.
So let's talk about some of the positive steps that are being taken to combat this problem. What's working?
So at the international level, you have things like Respect Women.
Okay.
It's a UN Women program, and it's all about preventing violence against women and girls.
And how does that apply to sport?
It provides guidance on how to take these broader principles and adapt them to the sports world
Okay.
to promote gender equality and create safe spaces.
So it's kind of like a toolkit
Yeah,
for
exactly.
organizations to implement.
Exactly.
Okay, cool.
Another really important resource is the Essential Services Package.
Okay.
And it outlines these crucial services for survivors of violence.
Like what kinds of things?
Legal aid, healthcare, psychological support.
So making sure that there's a safety net for people who experience abuse.
Exactly.
No.
And beyond those kind of international frameworks, there are some inspiring national initiatives.
Give me an example.
One that stands out is the Netherlands. They actually have a dedicated helpline
Okay.
specifically for reporting abuse in sport.
So it's not like a general abuse hotline.
No, it's specifically for sports.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's confidential, it's accessible to anyone involved in sports, and it provides guidance and connects people to other support services.
So it's like a one-stop shop.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Another great example is Germany's Strong Networks Against Violence campaign.
Okay.
They partnered with martial arts associations
Okay.
to offer self-defense classes and assertiveness training for women and girls.
Oh, that's cool. So there's like a two-pronged approach.
Yeah.
You're empowering the potential victims, but also trying to shift the culture that allows abuse to happen in the first place.
Exactly. Okay, cool.
And then there are sport for development programs
Yes.
that use sport as a tool for social change.
I love those. I think it's so fascinating how sports can do that.
There are some amazing examples out there.
Like what?
Box Girls Kenya, which uses boxing to empower girls,
Cool.
and Moving the Goalposts, Kilifi, also in Kenya, uses football to create safe spaces and teach life skills.
So it's about more than just playing the sport.
So much more.
It's about personal development.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And these programs challenge those harmful gender stereotypes and really highlight the power of sport to make positive change.
But at the end of the day, real lasting change needs to come from policymakers.
Absolutely.
So what specific recommendations does the handbook offer?
Okay, well, it calls for clear legislation that specifically addresses violence against women and girls in sport.
Okay.
So closing those loopholes that allow abusers to just escape consequences.
So strengthening the legal framework.
Exactly. And funding is key.
Yeah.
The handbook suggests dedicated funding for support services for survivors.
To ensure that they can access the resources they need to heal and seek justice.
It's more than just punishing the abuser.
Right.
It's about helping the survivors.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there's a real emphasis on training.
Okay.
So coaches and sports administrators need mandatory training on how to recognize and respond to abuse.
And that training should be more than just like, here are some red flags.
Yeah, you're right. The handbook talks about trauma-informed training, so making sure that anyone interacting with survivors understands the impact of trauma and can respond appropriately.
So you're not re-traumatizing someone
Exactly.
who's already been through so much.
Right.
Yeah.
And finally, the handbook calls for more research and data collection.
Okay.
We need to be able to track trends and measure progress.
Right.
And see where we need to focus our efforts. If we don't have the data, we're just operating in the dark.
This deep dive has been really eye-opening. The scope of this problem is huge, but it's also been inspiring to hear about all the people who are fighting to combat this.
It's been great to talk about it.
Yeah, and I think it's important for our listeners, those of you out there who are shaping policy and legislation,
Right.
to really take this information and use it advocate for change within your communities, within your organization.
Absolutely.
The handbook itself is a great resource.
Yeah.
And we'll be sure to link to other organizations and initiatives in the show notes.
Perfect.
And, I just want to reiterate, this isn't just about sport. This is about creating a world where women and girls are safe, respected, and empowered.
Absolutely.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. Let's work together to make sure that the power and the potential of sport is something that everyone can benefit from,